August 12, 2025, Eastern Ukraine. Before sunrise, Russia unleashed its largest strike in years: 180 drones, 120 T-90 tanks, and 1,500 elite troops, driving straight towards Zaporizhia. Their goal was simple: break the line, seize cities, and declare victory by morning. But the battlefield wasn't empty. Above, Ukrainian surveillance drones mapped every move in real time. Below, dragon's teeth, minefields, and hidden trenches turned farmland into a fortress. And on the ridges, Bodana howitzers and Oplot tanks waited for the order to strike. Would the billion-dollar assault smash through? Or were Russia's tanks and drones already rolling into the deadliest trap of the war? Let's uncover what happened next. The calm before dawn didn't last long. What followed was years in the making. A clash born not just of tanks and drones, but of pressure, politics, and desperation. For Russia, 2025 was a deadline. Nearly 3 years of war had drained its economy, stirred protests at home, and pushed generals to deliver something, anything, that resembled victory. Moscow needed momentum before the world's eyes, and fast. Intelligence streams hinted at why. High-level meetings with Washington loomed, and the Kremlin wanted leverage at the table. That urgency translated into steel. By midsummer, Ukrainian observers noticed something unusual in the south. Satellite passes, OSINT trackers, even intercepted chatter all pointed to the same truth. Russia was massing forces on a scale not seen since the first year of war. On paper, the buildup looked like 1,500 infantry with mechanized support, backed by up to 120 T-90 tanks and nearly 180 loitering drones. In other words, 3 to 4 battalions of armor, plus brigades of infantry. Far larger than the piecemeal assaults Ukraine had faced in 2024. And the choice of weapons said everything about Russia's intent. Swarms of Lancet III attack drones, cheap loitering munitions with AI-guided optics, would hunt artillery. Orlan reconnaissance UAVs, flying eyes with a 68-mile reach, would feed live imagery back to command. And then came the Garin drones, rebranded Shahed 136s from Iran, each carrying up to 110 pounds of explosives and capable of flying nearly 2,000 miles. These weren't for trenches. They were for cities, power plants, evacuation routes. For Moscow, drones were the hammer that softened defenses. But the real punch was meant to come from armor. Columns of T-90Ms, the ProRiv variant with relict explosive armor and modern sensors, rolled into staging areas. Each weighed 51 tons, which is about 56 US tons. Each cost upwards of $5 million, and each carried a 125mm smoothbore gun, capable of firing depleted uranium shells. Older T-90As and upgraded T-72s filled out the numbers, escorted by BMP infantry carriers and supply trucks. Witnesses described dozens of tanks idling in villages that had been quiet weeks before. The steel alone represented nearly $800 million of investment. Ukraine saw the buildup and understood the stakes. Engineers had been digging for months, carving defenses into farmland and riverbanks. Anti-tank trenches zigzagged for kilometers. Dragon's teeth, pyramids of reinforced concrete, lined the approaches. Soviet-era TM-62 anti-vehicle mines, crude but deadly, were buried by the thousands. And behind them, modern artillery waited. Ukraine's homegrown Bodana 155mm howitzer, with its 60 miles reach, alongside Western-donated M777s and older Soviet Tu-S5s. Oplot tanks, Ukraine's rare T-84 heavies, sat in reserve. The ground had been turned into a fortress. It was also a duel of economics. Russia had poured nearly $1 billion of tanks and trucks into the assault. Yet the weapons to destroy them, mines costing a few $100s, javelins at $100,000 apiece, or drones cobbled together for under $40,000, were vastly cheaper. NATO analysts warned of this arithmetic months earlier. Drones had already destroyed 65% of Russian tanks since the war began. Could a handful of $20,000 quadcopters dismantle million-dollar armor? And hovering above the battlefield was politics. Russian generals were under pressure to prove themselves after humiliations at Vuhledar and Bakhmut. Failure again would not only cost equipment but careers, and possibly their freedom. Success, on the other hand, could hand Putin the headline he needed: proof that Russia still dictated the war's tempo. For Ukraine, the message was different. This was not just about stopping tanks. It was about proving that preparation, ingenuity, and patience could undo brute force. And as the drones began to rise into the night sky, one question loomed over every trench and bunker. Would Russia's billion-dollar gamble break through, or collapse into fire before it even reached the front? 4:55 hours. The eastern sky was still dark when the first swarm rose. What looked at first like a flock of birds on radar resolved into something deadlier. Nearly 180 drones, launched in coordinated waves. Some were Lancets, short-range kamikazes built to dive straight into artillery. Others were Shahed 136s, Iranian imports rebranded as Garin, their lawnmower engines buzzing as they carried 40 kilos of explosives toward Ukrainian towns. Above them, Orlan 30 reconnaissance drones fed live video to Russian command screens, painting every trench and bunker in real time. The effect was immediate. Villages that had been quiet minutes earlier erupted in panic. Drones screamed into roofs, silos, power stations. In Poltava, hours from the front, one missile strike killed 15 civilians on a bus and wounded dozens more. To defenders in the trenches, it felt like the sky itself was falling. Ukrainian air defense crews snapped awake. Manpad's gunners fired stingers into the black. ZSU-23 anti-aircraft cannons rattled across fields. Some drones dropped, flaming wrecks spiraling into the dirt. But many punched through. The simple truth was numbers. 180 drones at once overwhelmed even layered defenses. By mid-morning, smoke curled over farms and roads. Power lines sparked. Civilians dashed for basements. One Ukrainian soldier later recalled, "They weren't even targeting soldiers. They were targeting tractors." The message was clear. Russia wanted chaos before its armor arrived. And for a time, chaos is exactly what it got. But Ukraine had seen this pattern before. Surveillance teams spotted the telltale signs of infiltration. Groups of 2 to 5 Russian soldiers, Spetsnaz and GRU commandos, slipping through hedgerows and riverbeds, aiming to cut wires, plant charges, sow confusion. It was a Cold War tactic, revived in miniature. Yet in 2025, it didn't work. Ukrainian FPV drones buzzed overhead, their cameras zooming onto crawling figures in fields. Minutes later, artillery landed with surgical precision. Entire patrols vanished in smoke. "It's routine now," one operator said flatly. "We catch them on camera and blow them up." Inside Ukrainian command bunkers, alarms wailed. Drone feeds lit up screens like a storm front. A brigade commander barked coordinates for counter-battery fire. Bodana howitzers, 60 miles away, fired back. In one instance, a single shell detonated the barrel of a Russian D-20 howitzer caught on the open ground. Even so, the volume of fire was heavy. Trenches shook as artillery roared in both directions. Ukrainian defenses adapted fast. Crews stretched metal nets over vehicles to snag incoming drones. Shotguns blasted FPVs out of the air. Soldiers hurled grenades at Lancets that nosedived too close. In one dugout, a squad wrapped their armored personnel carrier in wire mesh, turning it into a makeshift porcupine that drones couldn't pierce. Resourcefulness matched technology, but the sheer weight of the assault was impossible to ignore. And then, just as smoke obscured the horizon, came a different sound. The low rumble of engines, heavy, rhythmic, the sound of steel. From miles away, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Commanders staring at their feeds realized what was happening. The drones had been just the opening act. Reports streamed in. Columns of T-90 tanks, 45 tons, about 50 US tons each, were pushing forward from multiple staging grounds. BMP infantry carriers followed behind, trucks packed with soldiers trailing the armor. Intelligence estimates had been right. 3 to 4 battalions worth of armor, backed by 1,500 troops, were now in motion. Satellite imagery and local spotters confirmed it. A spearhead stretching for kilometers, worth nearly $1 billion in machinery and manpower, was headed straight toward Ukraine's defensive belts. In the trenches, one sentry radioed in panic. "Steel is coming." Mines were armed, javelins shouldered, RPG-29s prepped for close-range ambushes. Civilians fled deeper into basements. Villages emptied into silence, waiting for the roar to arrive. By late afternoon, the shape of the battlefield had changed. The drone storm had been bloody, yes, but it was just the curtain raiser. Now the real battle was forming. Dozens of tanks were advancing, their turrets swinging like predators searching for prey. The battlefield was about to shift from air and shadows to mud and steel. Ukrainian commanders tightened their grips on radios. The traps had been laid. Trenches, dragon's teeth, and minefields were ready. But everyone knew this next phase would decide whether the billion-dollar gamble succeeded or disintegrated before their eyes. The question hanging over every bunker was simple: and terrifying. When the tanks finally reached the front line, would Ukraine's defenses hold, or would the steel avalanche punch straight through? 19-20 hours. Dusk spread across the Donbass as the first tank columns emerged from the smoke. Headlights flickered through the haze, steel tracks grinding over frozen dirt. What looked like a ghostly procession quickly sharpened into a nightmare. Nearly 120 Russian T-90s, their turrets glinting, backed by BMP infantry carriers and long lines of trucks. The spearhead stretched for kilometers, a billion-dollar wedge aimed straight at Ukraine's defensive belts. For commanders in forward bunkers, the sight confirmed every warning. This was no probing raid. It was Moscow's heaviest gamble since the war began. An armored juggernaut meant to smash through in one decisive strike. The battlefield fell silent for a breath, then erupted as the first vehicles met the traps. Anti-tank ditches, cut just days earlier, swallowed T-90s whole. One tank pitched forward turret over hull, its 51-ton frame collapsing into the pit like a toy. Mines detonated beneath others, tearing tracks apart, spilling fuel, and igniting engines. Ukrainian engineers had seeded TM-62 charges along every likely approach. Now they bloomed one after another, black plumes marking the path of destruction. Within minutes, a dozen tanks were crippled. Radios buzzed with panic. "We're pinned down!" But chaos didn't stop the column. Tanks pressed forward into channels funneled by dragon's teeth and hedgehogs. These choke points looked like openings, but they were kill zones. Ukrainian spotters watched patiently, then signaled artillery. From hidden positions, Bodana and M777 howitzers slammed precision rounds onto the bottleneck. Drone feeds showed silhouettes of tanks vanishing into bursts of fire. And yet, the Russians kept coming. Dozens of vehicles churned through the smoke, turrets scanning, cannons firing blindly into villages and tree lines. Their advance was met by something invisible until the last second: modern top-attack missiles. Ukrainian infantry, crouched in dugouts, shouldered javelins and NLAWs. Each launch streaked skyward, arcing down into tank roofs. One missile pierced a T-90's relict armor, igniting ammunition in a flash. Another drone-guided mortar strike collapsed a BMP trying to flank. In the space of an hour, more than 20 vehicles burned. Still, the battle expanded. Russian trucks carrying infantry rolled forward, dismounting squads under the cover of smoke. But smoke couldn't hide from infrared. Ukrainian FPV drones hovered above, marking targets with smoke grenades. Mortars followed. Clusters of soldiers were caught in open fields, scattered by 120mm shells. Some tried to huddle behind stalled tanks, only to be crushed when another vehicle veered off course. By 21:30, parts of the wedge were jammed. The lead tanks couldn't advance, the rearguard couldn't retreat. Into this chaos surged Ukraine's counterpunch. From the flank, Oplot tanks rumbled forward, their 4.9-inch guns barking fire. Two Russian companies dissolved under the surprise attack. Command nets scrambled. Some units broke formation altogether. Then came something new: motorcycles. Dozens of small armored dirt bikes roared between wrecked vehicles. Riders leaned low, spraying suppressive fire, hurling grenades into foxholes, cutting through panic-stricken infantry. Dubbed Ukraine's modern cavalry, these assault squads struck where tanks couldn't reach, forcing Russian troops to scatter. One sniper team on bikes captured 2 Russian soldiers alive, stunned and wandering through the smoke. Every minute, drones layered more pressure. Ukrainian quadcopters swooped overhead, diving into turrets with explosives. Surveillance Orlans circled, streaming coordinates for artillery. Captured Russian Lancets, hacked and reprogrammed, were flown back against their original masters, detonating among stalled convoys. Technology turned the battlefield into a chessboard, where Russia's heavy armor moved like pawns, while Ukraine's drones played queens. By midnight, the spearhead was no longer advancing, it was choking. Tanks clogged ditches, trucks burned along roads, infantry huddled behind wreckage. From Kharkiv, intelligence officers counted losses: 40 tanks knocked out, 80 support vehicles destroyed or seized, hundreds of troops dead or captured. Radio chatter told the rest: "We're cut off. Send medevac. We can't move." Ukrainian signals units jammed frequencies, intercepting desperate pleas. On the ground, scenes mixed brutality with humanity. In one farmyard, Ukrainian medics gave water to a dazed young Russian driver, his face blackened by smoke. In another, captured soldiers raised their hands, trembling under searchlights. The war's cruelty stood beside its fleeting compassion. But even as Ukraine celebrated, they stayed wary. Helicopters strafed trenches, forcing defenders to duck. Artillery shells landed sporadically, killing and wounding a few. Ukrainian casualties were light compared to Russia's, dozens versus hundreds, but every loss weighed heavy. Commanders knew the fight wasn't finished. This was just the opening act of Moscow's grand offensive. Dawn revealed the scale. Charred tanks dotted the horizon. Columns of smoke marked Russian positions that once surged forward with confidence. Ukrainian trenches still held. Soldiers climbed out, weary but defiant. Their ambush had flipped the script. Russia's massive assault, built to overwhelm, had been turned into a death trap. And yet, no one believed the fight was truly over. Russian reserves were still massed behind the front. Command posts in Moscow had not gone silent. If 120 tanks could be thrown away in one night, what would come next? Would Russia double down, hurling more steel into the grinder, or pivot to something even more dangerous, like missiles that could strike far beyond the battlefield? By the third day of Russia's grand assault, the answer was clear. The spearhead had collapsed. The tanks once promised as unstoppable now sat gutted in ditches, their turrets blown skyward. Infantry that had marched forward with confidence were leaderless, scattered, and in many cases surrendering. Mines, drones, and precision fire had done what mass alone could not, halted Moscow's billion-dollar gamble. Ukrainian engineers moved methodically through the wreckage. Charges were placed under crippled T-90s to ensure none could be salvaged. A dozen armored hulks were turned into twisted scrap with a single coordinated blast. Captured Russians, some dazed, others openly weeping, were pulled from foxholes and barns. Nearly 20 naval infantrymen were lifted out in one sweep, their weapons abandoned, their morale broken. The numbers told a staggering story. Open-source trackers estimated at least 187 Russian T-90s destroyed or captured since the start of the war, and this battle alone added dozens to that grim tally. Reports claimed 16 T-80s, 34 armored vehicles, and 19 trucks wiped out in just days. Casualties mounted into the hundreds. Some analysts spoke of 800 or more killed or wounded in a fight that was supposed to bring Moscow glory. And yet, ambulance convoys never came. The wounded were left where they fell. By comparison, Ukraine's cost was almost nothing. Fewer than 100 combat casualties, most of them wounded artillerymen, stood against Russia's catastrophic losses. Only 2 Ukrainian vehicles, an aging APC and a transport, were destroyed. Local reporters described it with brutal imagery, a forest cut down while the loggers walked away untouched. But statistics only go so far. The human stories cut deeper. One Ukrainian infantryman recounted pulling a wounded Russian lieutenant out of the mud, binding his leg, and giving him a bottle of water. Photos of the moment circulated online, a strange mix of compassion amid carnage. A Russian mother, speaking to an independent outlet, admitted her son's unit had been annihilated. In captured notes, a sergeant begged for artillery support that never came. For civilians, relief was immediate. After nights of drones and artillery, their towns still stood. Farmers stepped out to smoking fields, shaken but alive. At border checkpoints, they hugged exhausted soldiers, murmuring thanks that the firestorm had passed them by. Politically, the fallout spread fast. Moscow's official media stuck to a one-line statement. Hostile forces were repelled. But silence told the real story. Kremlin insiders were furious. Officers were investigated, some threatened with dismissal. Whispers from military bloggers spoke of a disaster so severe it could not be hidden. Meanwhile, NATO seized the narrative. Photos of burning T-90s hit Western screens within hours. Diplomats pointed to the footage as proof Ukraine could win, with enough drones, shells, and air defense. Washington pledged more support. Brussels echoed the call. The failed offensive became a rallying cry for sustaining aid. For Ukraine's frontline troops, morale soared. Videos of tanks trapped in pits were turned into memes. A sapper company posted a map captioned, "Digging was worth it." Soldiers laughed grimly about turning wilderness into fortresses. "We told them they'd break on our traps," one lieutenant said, and they did. And yet, in Kiev's command rooms, no one mistook this for the end. Yes, Russia had been beaten here. Yes, its billion-dollar gamble bled into the mud. But Moscow still held reserves. Its missile brigades were intact. Its factories kept churning drones and armor. If 120 tanks and 180 drones could be lost in a single offensive, what would the Kremlin unleash next to prove it was still in the fight? Would the next blow fall on trenches, or on cities hundreds of kilometers away? What followed was not just a battlefield reckoning, but a shift in how the world saw modern war. Ukraine's ambush had not only shredded a Russian offensive, it rewrote the balance of credibility. NATO officials, watching satellite feeds of burning tanks, called it the most lopsided engagement of the war. Behind closed doors, generals noted how a nation outspent 20-1 had turned farmland and cheap drones into the equal of an armored army. In Brussels, planners moved quickly. Reports circulated showing that Ukrainian UAVs had been responsible for more than 65% of Russia's tank losses. Suddenly, drones worth tens of thousands were toppling machines priced at millions. Germany pledged a new line of kamikaze drones. The US signaled more long-range precision systems. The lesson was unmistakable. In this war, cheap and clever outpaced heavy and slow. Inside Moscow, however, the silence was louder than any statement. State television aired only a single line about repelling Ukrainian sabotage. But soldiers knew the truth. Captured radio logs told of panic, fear, and resignation. Conscripts whispered that no tank was safe, no matter the armor. One intercepted message ended with a chilling phrase: "We're targets on tracks." Doctrinally, the failure became a case study overnight. Analysts compared it to old world wars: trenches, spikes, mines, techniques a century old, combined with 21st century ISR and drones. The synergy was devastating. NATO's Allied Command praised the defense as a layered trap, funneling tanks into corridors, paralyzing them with obstacles, then finishing them with precision fire. For Russian officers, it was humiliating proof that doctrine had not kept pace with the battlefield. For Ukrainians, it was vindication. Soldiers who had dug ditches and buried mines joked online, every shovelful was worth it. Civilians joined in, turning memes of stuck tanks into viral symbols of resistance. One photo of a turret blown 30 feet into the air became a rallying image. Across the country, the message was clear. David had not just survived, he had broken Goliath's sword. Yet the psychological impact cut deeper. Ukrainians felt emboldened, proof that preparation and ingenuity could blunt even Russia's heaviest blows. Russian troops, by contrast, grew bitter. Prisoners admitted they were ashamed to return home empty-handed. Bloggers loyal to the Kremlin warned of plummeting morale. Commanders in Moscow quietly sacked officers, hunting for scapegoats. And globally, the battlefield became a laboratory. Western academies began drafting new manuals on drone artillery fusion. Think tanks warned that the age of armored supremacy had ended. For smaller nations, Ukraine's success carried a lesson worth gold. With patience and creativity, even the most expensive war machines could be humbled. But amid the analysis and celebration, one truth lingered. Russia's factories were still running. Missiles still sat in their silos. Drones still rolled off assembly lines by the hundred. This battle had broken one offensive, but it had not broken Moscow's will. The battlefield of August 2025 proved one truth: brute force can be broken, but preparation and resolve endure. Ukraine turned Russia's billion-dollar gamble into fire and silence, reminding the world that in modern war, cleverness outlives steel. The lesson is simple: victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the most prepared. If this story gripped you, support us with a like and subscribe, because the next chapter may be closer than anyone thinks.